Good morning, everybody. It's the start of a new week, and this week I'm wanting us to look at some of the poor decisions that are recorded in Scripture that believers have made. And the one thing about our Bible is that it doesn't hide the weaknesses, the failings, the poor decisions that the people of God have made throughout the centuries. And I want us to start this morning by looking at what we know about the life of a young man. Well, he started off as a young man by the name of John Mark. We know that he was close to the Apostle Peter, and Peter calls him my son in his first letter, chapter 5 and verse 13. Peter says, my son Mark. But Peter talks of himself as being in Babylon, quote unquote. So he was using code language, and it's pretty sure that Mark was not his physical son, his biological son, but that he was his spiritual son. And the early church fathers wrote about the fact that it was Mark who recorded the memories of Peter, and that's what is now part of our Gospel of Mark, which forms the basis of both Matthew and Luke as well. But Matthew and Luke knew about Mark's writings, and they drew on Mark's writings and expanded on them. But we know a little bit more about Mark. We know in Acts chapter 12, we're told that after Peter had been miraculously delivered from jail, that he goes to the home of Mary, we're told, the mother of John Mark. It's Acts chapter 12 and verse 12, where many had gathered. So we know that Mary must have had a fairly large home, which would have made her fairly well-to-do in the Jerusalem community. We also know, according to Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, that Mark was the cousin of Barnabas, Colossians 4:10, where the apostle says, he's writing about Aristarchus, who sends greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. And so we've got this young man who, as a cousin of Barnabas, was obviously with Saul and Barnabas in Antioch when they were commissioned on their first missionary journey. Acts chapter 13 and verse 13 tells us that on their first missionary journey, when they sailed from Cyprus to southern Turkey, they had John Mark with them when they sailed from Perga to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. Now that seems to have been a disappointing decision at best, because we know that was actually the cause of the rift between the Apostle Paul and his companion Barnabas, because when they got back to Antioch to report back to their home church and wanted to leave on their second journey, Barnabas wanted to take his cousin John Mark with them, and Paul wanted none of that. And they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. And that must have left John Mark feeling pretty miserable about the decision that he had made. He'd made a poor decision. He'd abandoned them on their first mission journey. And now he'd been the cause of a split between these two fine men of God. And yet, that wasn't the end of John Mark and his ministry. Obviously, I've already spoken about the fact that he ended up being a friend of Peter's, close to Peter, and writing down Peter's memories, recording Peter's memories for him. And the Apostle Paul himself, even though he was pretty fed up with the decision that John Mark had made to abandon them, when he wrote to the church in Colossae, he says, as you were instructed before, make Mark welcome if he comes your way. Make Mark welcome. And when he writes a personal note to Philemon, also in Colossae, he says, Epaphras sends you greetings, and so does Mark and Luke, my co-workers. So obviously, Mark had been restored in his relationship with the Apostle Paul. And then lastly, we read that when Paul wrote his final letter, his second letter to his friend Timothy, we read that he says, bring Mark with you when you come, for he will be helpful to me in my ministry. So there had obviously been reconciliation, even though the Apostle Paul was deeply disappointed disappointed enough to not want to take John Mark with them on the second journey. But here's the thing to note, that God never gave up on John Mark. And God doesn't give up on us either. Some scholars believe that there's this interesting verse in Mark's Gospel, which occurs nowhere else in Scripture. When Jesus was being arrested, you read in Mark 14, verse 51 and 52, that one young man followed behind him and was clothed in a long linen shirt. When the mob tried to grab him, he slipped out of his shirt and ran away naked. And scholars speculate that may well have been John Mark, because he was the only one who knew about that little incident. Nevertheless, having run away from Jesus' arrest, but you could understand that as a young man, probably a teenager, and then having made what seems to be a really disappointing decision on the first missions trip, nevertheless, God never gave up on him. And you might have made some disappointing decisions where you're aware that you've disappointed yourself perhaps, but you know that you've also disappointed God. And he doesn't give up on you. He still wants to use you. And so this morning, as you take time out, won't you just take a moment to think about times when you might have disappointed your Father? Times when you have left him hurt, where you know that he would have wanted you to do something and you've chosen to do something else. And yet know that he hasn't given up on you. And won't you just ask him to give you a chance to try again? And I pray that you'll experience that opportunity to try again, just as John Mark did.